Welcome to Dr. Creepin's dungeon. We all have the disease, you know. The disease of being finite. And death is the basis of all horror. 5 terrifying tales of body horror for you this evening. Later on we have Since When Do Mannequins Bleed by Bloody Spaghetti, followed by Seizures Are Only Supposed to Last a Few Minutes, and My Wife's Continued for 5 Straight Days by T.J. Lee. Then we have It Breathes, It Bleeds, It Breeds by Travis Kuhlman. We round off with The Gaze by Derek Hawk. But starting tonight's extravaganza is I Found a Lump on My Arm, Now We're All Going to Die by Richard Saxon. Now, as ever before we begin, a word of caution. Tonight's stories may contain strong language, as well as descriptions of violence and horrific imagery. If that sounds like your kind of thing, then let's begin.
Mortality is a weird thing. It hits you like a bag of bricks once you make it to your late 20s or early 30s. It's about the time when your family starts getting diagnosed with all kinds of disease, heart attacks, strokes, cancer. For me, facing mortality meant something as innocuous as finding an odd lump on my arm while showering. It might not sound like a big deal, but it's important to note that my younger brother died from osteosarcoma, a fairly aggressive bone cancer, and for him it was nothing more than a small, tender, unmoving lump he found on his leg. Even then, it was too late. He died a year later at the age of 7. Which meant I was absolutely horrified to discover a similar lump on myself. Over the course of a few days, as I awaited my doctor's appointment, the lump grew ever so slightly. It had a strange shape, like a column of bone that hurt to touch. During the examination, the doctor looked at me with concern in his eyes. It pretty much confirmed what I'd already suspected, that the growth was bone, and it would probably turn out to be cancer. He didn't hesitate in referring me to a radiologist and told me to return once the imaging had been done. A few days later, I returned, and as I sat in the office on the brink of tears, 1,000 thoughts ran through my head. What to tell my sister? How to spend the remaining time left on Earth? Would it hurt as much as it did with my brother? At the very least, they'd certainly have to amputate my arm, which would severely compromise my gaming abilities. Oh, can you even drive with one arm? Well, then the doctor called me in. He didn't seem concerned, rather baffled, as if he hadn't the faintest clue what was wrong with me. After some consideration, he finally started speaking, unleashing a jumbled mess of medical terms and incomprehensible sentences. He took a deep breath before finally stammering out, It's not cancer." Despite the presumably good news, he didn't seem relieved. There was something he was holding back. "Then, what's wrong?" I asked. It's a tooth." He couldn't explain it any further, so he just showed me the x-ray. Even with my limited anatomical knowledge, I could see it clear as day. The tooth was growing straight out of my ulna, its roots firmly cemented in the bone, while the crown pushed on the surrounding tissue. On the one hand, it wasn't cancer. On the other, I had an impossible, bizarre growth extruding from the wrong part of my own skeleton. The doctor sat down with me and explained the concept of teratomas, a type of benign tumor that frequently grows hair, skin, and, partially developed organs. Despite its unusual presentation, we settled on that idea and scheduled me for surgery. It was a quick and simple procedure. A couple of days later, they discharged me and told me to rest a bit before returning to work. I was content, though admittedly a little bit disturbed by the whole ordeal. life went on, and my arm healed up nicely. The scar almost completely covered up by the inappropriate amount of hair I'd started growing during my teenage years. A couple of weeks passed, and the surgery was all but a distant memory. And then, after a morning of increasing back pain, I found blood in my urine. Doctors will typically tell you not to get all riled up just because you found blood in your piss, because, well, it could be caused by pretty much anything. It might not be blood at all. However, I did worry, and with a sense of panic, I rushed to the emergency clinic, where they quickly tested my urine to confirm the presence of hemoglobin. That, alongside my back pain, made them feel confident I was suffering from nothing more than an innocent little kidney stone. One of the interns performed an ultrasound scan, just to rule out cysts and whatnot, but her casual demeanor quickly turned to an expression of fear as she put the sensor against my skin. She excused herself and left the room, only to return after 10 minutes, dragging with her an older, presumably more experienced doctor. He seemed annoyed to have been called in for something so simple as an ultrasound. He grabbed the device without introducing himself and tried looking for a kidney. Just as with the intern, his annoyed confidence quickly turned to one of worry, and he too left without explaining what the hell was going on. By then, my discomfort had turned to excruciating agony. It already put me on an overabundance of painkillers, but it barely put a dent in the suffering I'd had to endure. I stood up to grab a hold of the doctor, ready to demand answers, but once I got to my feet, my vision started fading, and I collapsed to the ground. From there, my memory was hazy. A combination of pain and drugs put me in a trance-like state. I vaguely remember being taken for some sort of scan, and a tube being shoved down my throat. And then, finally, everything turned black. It would take me 2 days to awaken once more, at which point I was greeted by a team of specialists, all looking way out of their depth. They explained as best they could that I'd fallen into a coma following severe internal bleeding, and that I was an inch away from death when I was brought into the operating theatre. I had almost died, and if not for an insane stroke of luck, I wouldn't even have realized. Despite the success of the surgery, they still seemed nervous. I could tell there was more to this story. After a lot of talking around the point, and even more bizarre medical terms I couldn't possibly comprehend, I got mad. Just tell me what the fuck is happening to me. The oldest of the bunch finally stepped up and started explaining himself. Mr. Woodcombe, to be brutally honest, we haven't the faintest clue what kind of affliction you've come down with. It's, quite frankly, beyond anything we've dealt with in the past. What does that mean? Am I going to die? I asked. He took a deep breath. We can't know how the disease will progress. But what is happening to me? I yelled as I tried to sit up, still too groggy from the drugs, unable to feel the presence of my own body. He explained what had happened to me, that my stomach had started migrating towards my left flank, where it had enveloped itself around my kidney, slowly but certainly absorbing and digesting it. The process obviously severed its blood supply, which caused the bleed that almost killed me. They'd fixed the tooth, and they'd stopped the bleeding, but a part of me knew it wasn't over. I'm still not fixed, am I? I asked. He shook his head. I'm so sorry, Mr. Woodcombe, but this disease, we don't know how to stop it. At this point, we're just treating the symptoms. By then I'd woken up enough to coordinate my movements, but I still couldn't feel my right arm. I turned my head to check on it, and saw that the vast majority of my lower and half my upper arm had turned almost completely white. I tried to lift it, but my muscles simply wouldn't budge. The skin looked so smooth, like perfect silk covering an almost shapeless blob. I'd always been skinny, albeit a toned person, so my veins were fairly prominent, except that now they'd all seemingly vanished from my forearm, leaving nothing but a stump of a vessel I could see actively retract away under my skin. It happened just before you woke up. There was no time we could... What the fuck is happening to me? I asked once more. We don't know, he said. I looked at him in despair. These were the people that were supposed to help me. Even the professionals were baffled, and I was screwed. Mr. Woodcombe, your arm has absolutely no blood supply. I'm sorry, but we need to amputate it as quickly as possible. You shouldn't even be awake right now. They made me sign a consent form before proceeding. Just the act of writing my own name with my one remaining functioning arm was an excruciating ordeal. Another few hours went by, and my right arm was a part of the past. Once I woke up from my third surgery, the doctors informed me that I was to be transferred to a more specialized health facility. They didn't even have the courtesy to call it a hospital. They airlifted me, wrapped in a containment box of sorts, to prevent the spread of a disease that could potentially be contagious. While flying, I was strapped down with no view of my surroundings. Wherever they were taking me, they wouldn't tell, and based on the few glimpses I got of the world beneath us, I wouldn't have known anyway. On the ground, I was met by a team of doctors dressed in hazmat suits. The health facility looked more like a warehouse than anything else, and didn't ease the growing fear within me. They rolled me through an airlock, ensuring nothing infectious could get in or out. Inside of the facility was a massive isolated room with hundreds of patients lined up next to each other. No rooms for privacy, no drapes to keep them apart, which meant they all probably suffered from the same condition as myself. One of the patients stared at me. He panted slow, shallow breaths as his chest had transformed into a thick wall of bone, each rib fused together, making breathing an almost impossible task. Another, younger woman, had skin that seemed to be shrunken a few sizes too small, stretching to the point where it had become a pathetic cover of epithelium, allowing her muscles to be clearly visible. But the worst was the patient in the bed next to mine. All his limbs had been amputated, and the entirety of his skin was covered in thick, bright red arteries, some of them actively bleeding, while others had been burned in a futile attempt at cauterizing them. He groaned in agony, almost inaudible, strained sounds coming from his toothless, tongueless mouth. His eyes and nose were missing, replaced by seemingly healthy skin, simply grown over most of his orifices, including his ears and scalp. He was trapped in pain, unable to hear, see, or communicate with the world around him. But if he could, I'm certain he would have begged for death. After a couple of hours of staring at the horrifically mangled people around me, a doctor approached me. He was a tired-looking old man that had been broken by the afflictions of others. "I'm Dr. Foreman. Your name is Eric Woodcombe, correct?" I nodded. "I'm going to administer a drug. It'll slow down the progression of the disease." "Will it help? Can you please help me?" I asked frantically. He looked around, seeming to check if anyone could hear us speak. "It'll slow it down, but it won't cure it. We're not even sure what causes this disease, but antimitotic drugs seem to put it into a sort of stasis." "What is it, exactly?" I asked with a trembling voice. "It is an infection, Mr. Woodcombe, though it's not bacterial, viral, fungal, parasitic, or prion in origin. All I know is that it affects anyone that touches it, and that we're not going to be able to contain it for long." I then asked a question I already knew the answer to. Am I going to die? He just nodded, his emotionless face never changing. How long do I said, before he interrupted me. A week, maybe 2. Once the disease has converted all of your organs to an incomprehensible mess, and when even the most experienced forensics teams will be unable to recognize your corpse as that of a human being, that's when you will die. His bedside manner left a lot to be desired, but it was obvious that he'd gone through that speech 100 times before. He was detached, desensitized from the nightmare that surrounded him. As he turned around to leave, I noticed his arm had bone spicules, skeletal spikes protruding through his skin. Doctor, your arm. He looked down at it and sighed. I told you it was infectious. Everyone in this room, staff, patients, even the dogs that lurked around the site. The guys outside wearing hazmat suits have been hunting them down, but it's too late for that. Not that their fancy protection gear will help them, but I'm not going to break that news to them. I was speechless, and he could tell his words hadn't comforted me in the least. He just didn't care. I'm sorry, but you should make peace with your family, friends, whatever you have in this world, because if we don't find a viable cure within the next week, they're torching this place. As the days progressed, they kept bringing in more and more patients. Some looked mostly normal, healthy even, while others were unrecognizable. Their faces replaced by a solid mesh of flesh, and their organs relocated to the surface of their skin. One of them had his heart placed outside his chest, beating as if nothing had happened, with thousands of additional arteries extending from it, like a red spiderweb covering most of his torso. The pain must have been too much, because as he walked past my bed, he grabbed his own heart, attempting to rip it off. A few of the arteries tore open, spurting crimson blood all around him, but the heart itself wouldn't budge. He groaned, and with one final pull, he fell dead to the ground, clutching a clump of meat he'd managed to pull from the now dead heart. As they lifted his lifeless body onto a stretcher, I got a better view of his face. I realized that I recognized him. He'd been the doctor that examined my lump, the tooth stuck in my bone. He had died because of me. On the 5th day of my containment, I started to lose vision in one of my eyes. I could feel it pulsating, growing within its socket, but I didn't dare look at myself in the mirror. A few hours passed, and suddenly I just felt a pop, followed by the sensation of a viscous liquid trickling down my face. My eye had exploded, and I still didn't have the guts to put myself in front of a mirror, or to call out for help. In a couple of days, they'll burn this place to the ground in an attempt at preventing the spread of whatever disease has infected us. The doctors aren't hopeful about a cure, but fire seems the safest option, just turning us all to ash. A price worth paying to save the world, I suppose. At least they're giving us a chance to call our loved ones. But I don't have much family left, so to speak. The thing bothering me the most is that I'll most likely die without knowing what had killed me, where the disease had come from, and how I could have avoided it altogether. Hindsight is 20/20 and all that. Not that it matters to me. I'm already dead. But whatever finally got me, it's still out there.
Our second tale of terror is, Since When Did Mannequins Bleed? By Bloody Spaghetti. That bastard Manny woke me up again in the middle of the night. I absolutely hate it when he does this. This time I guess he had a good reason to wake me up like that. I just wish he hadn't been an asshole about it. Manny and I, we have a strange relationship, I'd say. Even our meeting was weird. He just appeared at my place one day. He was there, sitting on my couch, reading my copy of Dan Brown's Angels and Demons. Well, I'll admit this much, his appearance at my place wasn't random at all. I can swear I'd seen him looking at me as if admiring me from a distance for weeks before our meeting. Well, it's hard to miss the guy. He sticks out like a thorn in a crowded side. Given his odd-looking head, well, Manny's appearance is mostly unremarkable, other than what appears to be a pale white smiling mask permanently fused to the skin of his head. Well, it looks like he has a purposefully deformed mannequin head stuck on his body, hence the name, Manny. Somehow no one else has ever noticed him. Usually people write me off as mental whenever I mention him, which is why I avoid talking about him to others. When I saw him sitting on my couch like he owned the damn thing, my instinctive reaction was to get mad. I yelled something obscene and pounced on the couch with the intent to maul him with my hands. What came next scared the living hell out of me. I hit the couch and flipped it over, but the bastard was gone. He disappeared on me before reappearing behind me and letting out that distinctive high-pitched chuckle of his. He said that he was going to play me like a marionette and then vanished again. I just sat there, flat on my ass, scared out of my wits. I had no clue what the hell had just happened to me. I'm still not entirely sure. It's been years now, and Manny comes and goes. Whenever he shows up, I know it'll be one heck of a ride. He pops up and does his best to make my life hell, not letting me sleep by being an incredibly loud, unwanted roommate, or by driving me nuts with his mostly moronic rants just before I go to sleep. Other times he shows up and just makes me feel like shit by giving me vivid accounts of horrible, horrible things about me and the world. His recollections feel as if he's feeding the imagery directly into my brain. I can quite see the horrors he's speaking of. Needless to say, that makes me feel terrible. I think he can even influence my dreams at this point. I swear, whenever I have a nightmare, I wake up to him standing at the edge of my bed, staring straight into my soul. Usually these nightmares, I think he gives me, are events from my past, amplified and perverted into haunting scenes straight out of some horror flick. Other times these nightmares are just distressingly weird things you'd not expect to see in your sleep. Like that one time he made me dream of me viewing black and white footage of what appears the main street of some city, devoid of people, with this dramatic music playing in the background. Well, the atmosphere of this whole thing felt incredibly off, but then came the truly horrifying part. Singing, quite a cheerful singing, came to flood my ears, forcing me to look around for the source of the sound. My dream self looked up, and above it, above me, hung women dressed in 20s outfits, singing from the streetlights, lifeless, swaying softly in the wind, and yet singing cheerfully. I woke up in a cold sweat to be greeted by the pallid mug of that bastard. Over the years, he'd pull some nasty trick where he'd stand there in the distance, making sure I see him before pulling out a long black rod and stabbing himself somehow as if with some voodoo magic. Well, I'd feel it wherever he stabbed himself. Usually the leg. God, it hurts so bad whenever he does this. He seems to have this gleeful expression on his face, like he's enjoying the pain while I want to scream as a result of the sensation of a boiling hot metal rod slicing through my nerves. The first time was as shocking as hell. God, I've bitten so hard through my lip due to the pain. I now have a scar there as a reminder of that day. But unfortunately, I've come to accept it as part of my experience with Manny. And that's not even the worst of it. The worst part about Manny isn't this sort of stuff, no. The worst part is when he pops out of nowhere and lets out a thunderous roar straight into my ear before vanishing again. Whenever he does this, I tense up like crazy. Oh, it's akin to having a cannon shot going off right next to you. Sometimes I stay tensed up for hours. Others, it goes away within minutes. After each encounter with Manny, regardless of what he does, I end up being stressed, vigilant and aggressive, and above all else, exhausted. Sometimes to the point of wanting to just throw myself off somewhere high. It's definitely affected me in more ways than one, hence why I mostly isolate myself from others. He is trying to ruin my life, I'm sure. I don't know why me. I didn't do anything wrong. I've always loved helping people. I didn't put on the uniform for the pay. I only ever wanted to do some good, The closest I could be to being a superhero, I guess. Well, I was sure he was trying to mess me up. Well, until tonight. This time it was different. He woke me up by shaking my body awake. Seeing his ugly mug before even fully waking up gave me that adrenal kick. I punched him square in the head. Although my fist never connected, it just went straight through his head. "Hey, hold up, doll," he yelled as I pulled my hand backward, cursing under my breath. "I'm here to help you," he continued. Well, I didn't believe him. He was just trying to mess with me again, I reasoned. So I tried ignoring him and going back to sleep. I shrugged him off and pulled the blanket tightly over my head. He shook me again. "Oi, Dolly, get up. This time I'm here to help. Pinky promise." "Oh, fuck off," I barked, trying to drown his presence out of my head with some pleasant memories. "Shh, they'll hear you." He shushed me. Well, something was wrong with that statement. Usually there were no others involved in his cruel jokes. I pulled the blanket from my head and looked him dead into his empty eye marks. "What are you talking about?" He mouthed, "Quiet down your tone." "Huh?" I questioned, confused and genuinely pissed off at this point. "There's 3 mannequins in your house. Oh, they don't mean no good, Dolly," he whispered. "Bullshit," I barked back with a whisper. I didn't even know why I was whispering, really. "Listen for yourself, Dolly," Manny hissed, pointing at where his ears should have been. I did as he said. It was dead silent. I was going to throw another fit at the creature that's been haunting me for the last few years, but then my thought process was cut short by the sound of footsteps. 2, 4, 6. My heartbeat sped up. I slowly got out of my bed, walked towards the bedroom door. I always kept it locked, even though I live alone. It's an OCD thing. I stood by the door and listened. Someone was definitely walking around in my house. 3 people, in fact. They were saying things I couldn't understand. Well, they were too quiet. My breathing was becoming shallow and my body was getting hot. I could feel my own temperature slightly rising. Manny whispered, "Told you." I just stared at him, and he took a step back. Well, that had never happened before. Some switch inside me flipped, and the bastard smiled at me. I just kept listening to what was happening outside the room. The pallid bastard opened up a closet and pulled out my 2 baseball bats before telling me to pick one. He knew what was going through my head. He knew exactly what I was going to do. I took one of the bats, the black one. It felt nice in my hand. Manny vanished. I cranked my neck, and the door handle twisted. The door to my room swung open, and before me stood a literal mannequin. I could almost hear something snap inside. It didn't expect me to be awake. I moved swiftly, expertly, nearly took its head off with the bat. The sound of cracking, thick plastic boomed in my ears. The mannequin collapsed to the floor. I went out to the hall. Another mannequin stood with its back to me, this one white. I think there was something attached to its plastic hand. I took a swing to its back, and it bent in half before collapsing on all 4s. A second hit to the back of the head. It wasn't moving anymore. The third one saw me, a brown one, and it ran towards the front door. I followed. I wasn't going to get out just like that. I caught up to it. It started making pleading movements with its arms. Ugly piece of shit. I slammed the bat on top of it. I swung once, twice, thrice. I swung over and over again. Then it was crumpled on the floor, with many parts collapsed in on themselves. Once I was done with the third mannequin, Manny popped up again. He spat his poison in my ear once more. Tie him up and dump him in the garage for now. I did just that. I wasn't even thinking on my own. I was on an autopilot. Good thing the front door was unlocked. Well, the adrenaline wore off quickly, and I was exhausted once more, completely worn out man. I headed back up to my bed, almost as if nothing had happened. I was pretty docile and relatively calm after that. Well, I passed out on the spot pretty much. Manny was nowhere in sight, thank God. I slept like a baby. Waking up this morning, I remembered what had happened the night before, and my mind raced again, forcing me to feel like the world would collapse on top of me if I didn't check the garage. The moment I got out of bed, cortisol filled my system up once more. I noticed a massive blood stain on the floor. Since when do mannequins bleed? Today's third story is Seizures Are Supposed to only last a few minutes. My wife's continued for 5 straight days. If you've ever seen someone endure a seizure before, or been the unfortunate sufferer of one, I don't need to tell you how horrific it is to be a part of. And if you haven't, count yourself lucky. There are few things in this world more mentally scarring than seeing another human being convulsing on the floor as their eyes roll into the back of their heads, their jaw clenched and their joints rigid as they shake, or, if you're very unfortunate, writhing around and even dislocating joints as they search for new ways to bend and snap. All of us have seen it in the movies, sure, but it pales in comparison to the real thing. To actually stand there as someone's brain is stuck on repeat and their body is a slave to the misfiring signals as you woefully stumble around, unsure if you're supposed to put something in their mouth to stop them biting their tongue. Spoiler alert, no, never. Call an ambulance immediately, or just leave them to it. Imagine that feeling of helplessness in front of a stranger, and then compound the grief by tenfold when it's your entire world, and you've just gotten home from work to find them writhing on the ground for the 7th time this year. Your first thought isn't ambulance, medication, or anything like that. No, it's to check that she hasn't smashed her skull on the coffee table, that she's not choking on her own vomit, and then to make an educated guess at how long she's been seizing for. No epileptic wants an ambulance called every time this occurs, so you have the unenviable task of timing their suffering before calling one, usually about 3 to 5 minutes. This is my reality, and one that I will willingly bear if it means that I can save her as much as she's saved me over the years. Lucille is a bright, vibrant, and unbelievably creative soul. She is capable of painting the most incredible pieces of landscape portraiture while telling a crass story that would make even a dominatrix blush, a voice that bounced in your skull long after it had finished its journey into your ears, and she has a zest for life that had me head over heels from the moment we met. What she first saw in a geeky kid who loved family and nights staying in more than extravagant parties is beyond me, but I never stopped being my true self from the first conversation, and I guess it just stuck. Which is why now is so fucking hard for me to deal with, why I'm coming to you all here to talk about this. I'm telling you all this because I want you to understand that Lucille was special. To me, she was my everything, and someone I would move heaven and earth for. People say that all the time, but so few mean it. I would do things that I'd let haunt me with a smile for the rest of my life if it meant hearing her say she loved me one last time. Understand, I'm just a man doing right by his wife, or at least trying to. Coming here helps. Maybe it's part therapeutic and part guilty conscience. I hope by the end of this, you'll understand where I'm coming from. Lucille was first diagnosed with a tumor in the fall of 2017. We'd been married for 3 years and she'd been steadily suffering absences in her memory for around 6 months leading up to the first seizure. To begin with, it was the usual tip-of-my-tongue moments we all get. Then it progressed to forgetting her keys and being locked out for an hour after finishing work. It grew into more concerning things like nearly setting fire to our kitchen as she would go and take a bath with the stove on, before the final straw came along when she neglected to stop at a red light after forgetting to hit the brakes and careened into an electrical pole. When the police found her, she was gripping the steering wheel so tight with her jaw clenched so hard that they worried she was suffering a psychotic episode. The adjustment to her condition was, well, tough. Doctors rarely have great bedside manner at the best of times, and when our physician advised to either go on a $145,000 treatment plan with 25% success or look into hospice care ASAP, and that the Swiss are nice people if we'd ever thought about dignitas, well, suffice to say, my wife stormed out and resolved to use her artwork to ensure she never forgot again. Her determination was anything but dampened. I dare say it pissed her off. So, like any good husband, I supported her and ensured that, at the very least, she got her medication while she tried her own art therapy. She would start painting small, innocuous icons on sticky notes around the house. Things like a yellow sticky note next to the front door, with a slew of creative iconography reminding her to get her keys, and a doodle of her standing under a stormy cloud outside, if she forgot. Or a picture of a pill bottle with overly happy faces on a blue note by her bedside cabinet and in the bathroom, to ensure she got her daily dosage of anticonvulsants. For a time, these actually helped, and I'd get used to finding small notes around the house, even for me, little reminders of her love in the form of short messages like, "I love how much you laughed with me today," or, "I appreciate you giving me a neck massage after the last seizure." And it never stopped being a welcome sight. Those first couple of months convinced me that she was going to beat this. She would overcome it and sell her story to Time magazine and become a therapist of the century for her groundbreaking discoveries on memory retention. I'm sure you all know, however, that we rarely ever get what we want. It was the late summer, and I'd been working away a lot more than I wanted. As an architect, I took whatever contracts I needed. Medical bills are seldom ever totally affordable in this freaking country. Even with insurance, our deductible was still high. So the contract I ended up taking was nearby if anything went wrong, but far longer hours than I was used to. I'd been working a particularly lengthy afternoon when I came back to the sounds of grunting and snapping, finding Lucille's fragile form on the ground and next to the coffee table where her head had made contact with the corner before landing on the ground and nestled in a pool of her blood. You have to understand, we took every precaution, and sharp edges or areas she was likely to hit if she seized were always far away from her. The table was in my personal study room on the second floor, and the rubber corner protectors were taken off of it. I rolled her over and soothed her as I'd done many times before, calling 911 the moment I spied blood. Thankfully, they were over within minutes and took her into the ambulance. But unlike so many other times, she was not coming out of this one. Now, as the title suggests, she continued to seize as they strapped her down, her joints flailing and smashing against the EMTs, the metallic walls of the ambulance, and anything they could find until she was mercifully sedated. "You should get her things. It's not likely she'll be coming home tonight," one of the EMTs called back to me,
sweat dripping off their brow after finally putting her down. I knew the drill by this point, but it was still painful to hear. I nodded and told him I'd follow on as soon as I gathered everything. Heading back into the house, I realized I hadn't noticed some of the extra sticky notes dotted around the living room, leading to the edge of our stairs. They weren't placed on the walls, but instead hung by a thin black thread that Lucille must have pinned from end to end in strategic places on the house. Wondering if she'd documented how she felt and if it was potentially relevant to her physician, I grabbed the nearest one and read it. Don't forget, you'll be making contact at 4:42 p.m. sharp. Wear loose clothing and do not take your meds. A small stop sign with a blind eye in the center peering back at me. Why the hell would she tell herself not to take her medication? Confused, I went to the next one a few feet away and felt the hairs on my neck stand on end as I did so. He's offered me a deal. I can explore more of his world if I give up 1 month of my lifespan each time I enter it. Seems fair to me. He called it the decadent plane. Must remember that next time. Oh, and to call him the fringe god. He didn't like being called a black mass. Next to this one were 2 small drawings, one of Lucille's body floating around pillars of steel and light with a huge mass at the center. The other simply writing the words, fringe god, over and over, progressively getting more scratchy with each consecutive entry. Hands shaking, I frantically ran through the living room and up the stairs to our bedroom, grabbing as many notes as I could in the process. Concern for how far her mental state had deteriorated was building within me as I scanned each entry. Today I had a seizure. In the process, I got to dive deeper into the amorphous golden shroud and see the beauty that dwelled within. I want to remember it, but I'm too nervous to even write it down. I gotta stop taking my meds. Too much interference. Maybe I could paint some of it. Tried painting the visage of the Nocturne one. His crown too beautiful for me to even put onto canvas. I tried to speak his name aloud, and I ended up with a migraine. Picturing him in my head just made me cry. It hurts so much, but I cannot wait to get back there. Today was special. The fringe god gave me a better offer than before, and I swear the Nocturne one wept from beneath his flesh mask as the offer was made. If I did exactly as he said, I'd be able to explore the inner sanctums of the decadent planes and gain knowledge I could bring back with me. I have to remember these plans when I get back. I looked at the final drawing, and I felt sick. She'd drawn steps for how to cause bleeding in her brain, and a seizure so strong that it would effectively kill her if I hadn't come home when I did. More drawings were strewn across her canvas, but I had no time to peruse as my cell phone rang and I realized how much time I'd wasted in the apartment. Mr. Loomis, it's Dr. Mitesh. If you aren't already on your way down, you need to get here immediately. Your wife, she... Arriving at the hospital and apologizing profusely for my terrible parking on the curb, I rushed in and headed straight for the neurology ward. Notes tucked into my pocket as I tried my best not to bump into other visitors. My mind focused on one thing, Lucille. I turned the last corner and I heard the screaming before I saw the staff. It was filled with pain and terror, and it absolutely belonged to my wife. Spotting a nurse leaning against the window, I approached him and tried my best to keep my composure. My wife, Mrs. Loomis, is she... I breathed, my eyes darting to the foreboding double doors, back to the obviously shaken-up nurse. He tried to be professional, but whatever was going on was far beyond his experience level. She's not stopped seizing since we got here. We've tried sedating her several times, but it's not doing her any good. I'm sorry.
The screaming got too much and I had to take a breather. The doctor should be out for you soon. Excuse me. He rushed past me and I chalked it up to nerves in a new environment. Waiting around for half an hour and staring at the notes did nothing to calm my nerves, nor did Dr. Mitesh when he finally came out and ushered me to a waiting room. He explained to me that she wasn't just having one continuous seizure, or at least he didn't think so, but was instead having consecutive seizures one after the other without any rest. I've honestly not seen anything like it, he began, hands rubbing each other as he spoke. I've tried to get a scan of her brain, but, well, not safe, right? I chimed in, fully aware that any person mid-seizure is a liability. My wife may be small, but she packed a punch at the best of times. Right. We've upped the dosage to bring her to a calm state, but it seems to wear off quickly. I've requested our head of neurology, and hopefully she can shed some light on this. In the meantime, you're welcome to sit with her, but I must apologize in advance for the straps. He saw my eyebrows raise and clarified. This is a precaution, I assure you. We've just managed to fully put her under, but we don't want to take chances or have her cause more harm to herself. He leaned forward. We will get to the bottom of this. I promise you. He led me back into her room, and for the first time in what felt like weeks, I looked upon my poor, broken wife. Her face was bruised up from the knock she'd taken as she fell, head bandaged up with gauze, and her face scrunched up in a permanent grimace. It never ceased to horrify or hurt me to see her body after it's been through an ordeal such as this. Tears ran down my face as I sat next to her and resisted the urge to hold her hand, instead just electing to sit and try to talk to her. Hey Lulu, it's Arthur. Yeah, I come back once again to help pick up your goofy ass. I giggled, sniffing hard at our own lame attempts to downplay her debilitating illness. You know, you really scared me today. I thought I was going to lose you. Pulled out some of the notes in my pocket and figured it would make good conversation while I waited for the neurologist. I found these notes while I was getting your things. I wish I'd known just how bad things had gotten. But I was so busy working, I didn't see the signs. I'm so sorry, Lucille. I felt the lump in my throat as I fought back tears. Never be sorry when a deal can be made, Vessel. Words fail to truly encapsulate what happened next, but I'll make a meager attempt. I saw it slinking around on all fours from beneath her bed at first, a hulking dark mass of shifting substances. Jagged, thick limbs ending in hooves, carefully planted, and the mass tensing as it began to rise from the other side of the bed. A humanoid torso rose, and I swear that, had anyone else seen what I'd seen, madness and death would have permeated that hospital. It defied logic and reasoning, but I couldn't look away. A hairy male torso with the spine protruding towards me, and two amorphous arms jutting out of their sockets and pressing on the back as the head, oh God, the head, snapped forward to look at me. The skull was of a creature resembling a deer, with flecks of black flesh hanging off the bone, white orbs beaming in the sockets, and antlers made from the arms of a human protruding from either edge of it, muscle and sinew showing through as if it was in the process of shedding. I wanted to retch, to scream, to throw my body over Lucille's, but I was transfixed. Your bondmate made a choice with the grains of sand she had left in her hourglass. She elected to boost her limited understanding. The voice was smooth and almost disarming in nature. I was terrified to my core, but enraptured by every syllable. You may still save her, Vessel, but is that what she wants? It cocked its head to the side and stared at us both, the question ringing out in my head for a few moments afterwards,
as flashes of Lucille and I in better days went through my mind. Her knack for exploration, love of art, and her laughter all jostling for position in my head before I snapped back. Why wouldn't she want to be here, with me? What kind of question is that? Terror gripped me, but grief is a powerful motivator. Can you save her or not? What do I need to do? It dug its claws into one of the antlers, as if thinking before replying slowly. I can, but suffering awaits. The response rang out, and it gave no further elaboration, save for pointing at her and saying, she must wear the crown. And then pointing to me, adding, you must bear the guilt. A small, lamprey-like creature appeared from the neck of this fringe god, and he pulled it off, the shrill cry ripping into my ears, as many eyes and teeth felt immediately locked onto me. She will be saved, but your guilt will be eternal, vessel, he reiterated, holding out this parasite that was pulling at his emaciated digits to get to me. Do you accept the gift? Do you pledge yourself to the fringe? I swallowed and nodded, reaching out to take whatever the fuck is in his hand. But the antlers grabbed me first, pulling me over the bed and deep into this monstrosity's eyes. Show me solidarity first, vessel. Earn your seat at my table. And in that moment, it was as if he was never there. Like I'd snapped awake from some unexpected nap. Groggy, I looked around and cast my eyes towards my wife. She was staring right at me, horror stricken across her face, as she began to open her mouth wider and wider, unblinking as she did so. Her eyes rolled into the back of her head as a cacophony of screams erupted from her, and her body began to jerk violently. It was on a different scale than any seizure I had ever witnessed from her previously, and before I even had a chance to react, her nurses ushered me out and took over. She carried on seizing for the next 90 hours. No matter what anyone did, she would persist. Her body was riddled with bruises, and her vocal cords by this point were long since ruptured. A whispering yelp, all she was able to muster. Her body began to fail her on the 5th day, and while she was contorting into horrific positions for her body to attempt to support, her strength was fading rapidly, and the doctors were able to restrain her with greater ease. The neurologists were stumped. Experts across the US had no concrete idea, and the sole consensus they could come to was that the tumor was now pressing more into her brain, and the seizures would not cease without risky surgery. They gave me time to think it over, of course, letting me sit with her again now that she was in a more sedated state, though I was terrified to do so. Before going in, I resolved to try and sleep in the adjacent waiting room. Having not received any proper news or resolution since this began, I now felt a degree of weight had been lifted, and that if I was going to see my wife for potentially the last time, it would do me good to do so with a clear mind. Now, I don't know if you'd call it a dream or a nightmare, but what I saw in that space was more vivid and tangible than anything that had come before it. I was your typical dreamer, barely remembered my experiences unless they were emotionally driven or traumatic. But this was on a whole new level, and I can still remember the way it looked, smelled, and even felt on my skin as I floated. I dare not go into detail here. I fear that may break the pact I now have with the fringe god. I will say that my wife was right in her notes. She did not do it any justice. I only had glimpses of the gate she stood in front of. Both were shut to me, and lumbering Goliath stood on either side, bearing down on me as I floated aimlessly, unsure of how to proceed. Once again, the fringe god appeared in front of me, leaning forward as he spoke. "Your pact is about to be complete, vessel. Are you prepared for the hardships ahead? Are you ready to worship?" As he finished, the gate opened up just enough for me to see my wife behind it. Her smile broke through the fog in my mind and put me at ease in a way I never thought I'd experience again. Without thinking, I nodded. "Whatever it takes to free her, I'm ready," I replied, resolute. "Then the pact is sealed. I will allow you to say goodbye before the traversals begin on the next lunar cycle." He extended an antler, and I begrudgingly gripped it. "Why would I need to say goodbye here?" I asked. The fringe god shook his head. "Not here. Your guilt begins now." I lied to her. I lied to myself. I lied to you. I'm sat in the waiting room. I can feel the sheer weight of my sins bearing down on me like a freaking lead weight in my shoulder or a leech attached to my neck, growing fat and engorged on every black mark from my life. The hardest part of watching someone you love die slowly is never knowing when to let go. Living in a perpetual state of agony and wondering if this is your last day eating breakfast, your last ever "I love you," or your last ever kiss. Everything mundane becomes ecstasy, and you savor those quiet moments when you're not stressing over medication, palliative care, or what your life will be like in the lack long after. Lucille loved her art. She loved creating fantastical monsters she could immerse herself in, and I adored creating and building those worlds as an architect and designer. We bonded over that love of the weird and unusual so many years ago, and it was what kept us strong through those darker days. Even now, its influence can be felt through every word you see upon this recount of events. I didn't just time her seizure because I knew it could be a mild one. I did it because I was determined to make sure, if she died, it was in her home and in my arms, with dignity. I must deal with that blame for the rest of my life, and every time I look in the mirror, I see the fringe god staring over my shoulder and reminding me of what I did, reminding me of my sins. Lucille is on life support in the next room, and as soon as I finish this documentation, this confession, I'll do the merciful thing and let her go. I will hold her hand, kiss her forehead, and hold those post-it notes tightly as she slips away and falls into the realm she was so desperate to stay in. It is the right thing, no matter the cost of my sins. Maybe I'm at peace with it because I know that this was an inevitability, that blaming myself is exactly what any widower of a terminally ill loved one would do, that my timing was at its core just standard practice, regardless of my selfishness. Maybe it's because I know she was a passionate believer in dying with dignity, and she fought tooth and frickin' nail to stay alive as long as she could. Or maybe it's because when I slept last night after I'd said my goodbyes, I saw her in that indescribable realm, smiling at a distance with the nocturnal one's arm protectively draped over her shoulder. The obelisk of Sonder was my sole means of emotional communication between us, as I sat in the Stygian void between the dream world and the realm she now inhabits. Maybe I know that the good days, when I catch her smile shining off the horizon, are worth every ensuing night terror that springs forth unspeakable creatures that threaten to tear me from my fringe god, to tempt me to their realms with promises of forbidden desires, as they torture every corner of my mind. All that I know is that I'll go to sleep tonight, and I will, once again, see her. Whether it's real or not doesn't matter. My fringe god fulfilled his end of the pact,
Now it's my turn to do the same. Tonight's fourth tale of terror is, it breathes, it bleeds, it breathes.
I've always been a sick child. It was never bad enough to warrant a trip to the hospital, but it was always something that was hanging over me. I was smaller and less energetic than most kids my age. While they preferred to run around and play outside, I chose to stay inside and read. The slightest bit of activity was enough to exhaust me for days on end. It wasn't a bad life, but I can certainly see how it made me into the introverted person I am today. I took comfort in books, and I experienced the world through them. It wasn't until I turned 23 that I began to question myself. Everyone around me seemed to be getting married and settling down, but I wasn't. I had a few friends at work, but no one I really hung out with in my free time. My family was gone. I lost my father at a very young age to a heart attack, brought on by a lifetime of high cholesterol. And my mother passed away shortly after I graduated college, from an extremely malignant form of pancreatic adenocarcinoma. My mother clung on to life for a few weeks before her body shut down. I remember my last memory of her in the hospital. She was so thin that it looked like the slightest breeze would take her from me. Her eyes were bright and feverish, and her skin was yellowed like the pages of an old book. The palliative, Demerol, that they were giving her to ease her into her final moments robbed her of any coherent last words. She just stared at me with her glassy eyes as the end came for her. I clutched her hand in mine, but it was like she wasn't even there. I told her I loved her. She didn't respond. She just closed her eyes and let everything go. I decided that it was time for me to do the same. I had no close family nearby, or any real friends. I was alone in the world. I put in my 2 weeks' notice at the small company that was gracious enough to hire me fresh-eyed out of college, and left town shortly after my mother's funeral. In all honesty, I didn't want to stay there any longer. Everything reminded me of what was gone, and what I was missing out on. After selling our house and settling the matter of her will, I had enough left to get far away. I chose the countryside. I wanted to be alone with my thoughts for a while. I felt like I needed some time to work through everything and decide on my next course of action. My inheritance afforded me that privilege. In hindsight, I realized that this was the worst possible choice in my life. Living alone, with only my thoughts to keep me company, a mile away from my closest neighbor, only served to deepen my sense of isolation. I was alone with my thoughts, and I quickly realized that none of them were good. I think my mental state only quickened my descent into sickness. It began when I noticed a small mass on my left upper arm, just underneath the skin. It was about the size of a pea, and I could move it around under my skin, about 1/4 of an inch or so in each direction. At first I told myself it was a fatty deposit and nothing to be concerned about. Under palpitation, I experienced a slight discomfort, but no more than that when manipulating any other section of my body. It wasn't until I noticed that it was slowly growing that I began to get concerned. I eventually broke down and went to see a doctor, who assured me that it was likely a lipoma or xanthoma, and was nothing to be concerned about. He reassured me that it was more likely a symptom of high cholesterol, rather than a sign of cancer. He explained that, while family history and genetics had given me a bad hand, that didn't necessarily mean I couldn't live a long, healthy life. I was still unsure about the lump, which led me to asking if we could biopsy it. He reasoned that there was no real need to do so, that they were harmless. Since the mass was movable under my skin, it meant that it was encapsulated and was likely benign. He said that getting a sample would only confirm what we already knew, and would cost me about $400. He advised me to cut back on my red meats and to come back if I noticed any change in the lipoma. I thanked him and left the hospital feeling comforted. That reassurance lasted about a month. For the first days, I was constantly poking and prodding the small lump. After about a week, when I was confident that the mass hadn't grown any, I went back to my usual life of solitude. I woke up late every morning and read. I did some minor chores around the house and thought about what direction I wanted my life to go in and what field I wanted to work in. Sometimes I would go days without talking to anyone. Looking back, I now realize how unhealthy it was to isolate myself after my mother's unexpected death. I was stagnating, and I didn't even realize it. About a month after getting my lipoma checked out, I began to experience a stinging pain in my upper left arm. That discomfort brought back the memory of my visit to the doctor. The mass on my arm was now dime-sized. I could still move it, but now the slightest touch felt like I was being poked with a needle. I left it alone for a few days, hoping against hope that it was all in my imagination, but the pain continued. I think some sad part of me thought that it would go away if I just ignored it long enough. To be honest, I was afraid of going back to the hospital. That was partly due to the fact that I was afraid of what the diagnosis would be. A growth can be a symptom of cancer. My mother's experience in the hospital also kept me from going. I lived with the slowly growing mass for about a week before I realized how dire the situation was. It wasn't until I woke up one night with a stinging pain in my arm that I decided to go back to the doctor. I rolled out of bed and went to the bathroom to look at my arm. I figured that I'd slept on it wrong, or possibly struck it against something, and that was what was causing me pain. I realized how wrong I was when I flipped on the light switch and saw a small bit of caked blood around the area on my upper arm. I hopped into the shower to wash away the silver dollar-sized splotch of blood and had a startling realization. There was a fingernail sticking out of my arm. At first I thought that I'd inadvertently rolled over and accidentally jabbed a clipped toenail into my skin. But as I went to pull it, I experienced a sudden tearing pain that actually made me gasp. It felt like I'd grabbed a nerve ending and pulled on it. I rinsed off the area and examined it. The nail appeared to be sticking out of my skin rather than piercing it. When I painfully shifted the lipoma, the nail wiggled and receded further into my skin, as if it was part of the mass itself. I made up my mind there and then to go to the doctor first thing in the morning. At first, the doctor tried to rationalize it the same way that I did. He said that it was likely a lipoma, and my constant worrying was just making it more pronounced. It wasn't until after I showed him the area that he began to take me seriously. He concluded that the skin ruptured outward instead of inwards, which meant that it had come from under my skin and poked out. I asked if he would excise the lump so we could examine it, and he agreed, due to possible risks of infection, and to identify the cause for the growth. I turned down his offer of a general anesthetic. He tried to convince me that it would be easier with one, but I asked for a local anesthetic instead. I remembered my mother's final moments. Even if it was going to be a simple procedure, I didn't want to experience anything like that ever in my life. A part of me realized that it was my fear of being in the same situation as her that made me so stubborn about the anesthetics. After he explained the procedure to me and its risks, I followed him into the operating room, laid down on the table, and waited for him to begin. I did my best to look away while he worked. I imagined turning my head to see what was happening, only to sneeze into the open wound, or faint from the mere sight of the surgery. I did gather up enough courage to look towards the end, though. I looked up into the mirror to see about an inch of skin peeled away, with a slightly red mass beneath it. It didn't look nearly as grotesque or as sickening as I'd thought. Instead, it looked clinical and clean. He set an object in the tray and proclaimed, "Phew, think I got it. Now, let's just see what we have." I heard him drop the heavy tweezers on the ground, as if something had shocked him. I went to look, but he told me I needed to stay still until he could suture up the area. He reassured me that the utensil had just slipped out of his hands, and it was nothing to be worried about. I waited for 10 agonizing minutes of uncertainty as he sutured the area and swabbed it down again with betadine. When he finished, I sat up and looked at what he'd set down in the tray. It was a greyish mass that was about the size of a misshapen marble. Through the antiseptic scent of the hospital, I smelled something like spoiled meat. I felt my stomach turn as the realization that this had been inside me and had just begun to rot. One end terminated in what looked like a fingernail that had broken through my skin. It wasn't until he asked me if I knew what the term fetus in fetu meant that I connected all the macabre pieces of the jigsaw. Fetus in fetu, a parasitic twin. We went into the examination room where the doctor explained what he thought was happening as he gave me a complete look-over. He posited that I'd started off with a twin, but somewhere along the way, I'd absorbed my twin into my body. It had likely siphoned off nutrients, which explained my lethargic activity and smaller stature when I was younger. He assumed that the mass had been reabsorbed by my body over the years, and there was likely nothing left except that small piece we had just removed. As he palpitated my back and his face turned cold, I knew that that was not what had happened. The doctor said he felt something just above my right kidney, and that exploratory surgery was necessary. He told me that the sooner they performed the surgery, the better. I agreed, and he asserted that I would need to be completely anesthetized for the operation. It was then that I was forced to accept my worst fear. I would have to be sedated like my mother was. I tried to talk my way out of the situation, but my doctor explained that this was a life-threatening issue that needed to be resolved. I eventually relented and consented to the surgery. I spent a sleepless night in the hospital with my stomach growling at me the entire time. I prayed it was my stomach growling at not having eaten all day, rather than the partially formed fetus of my twin inside me. The anaesthetist arrived about an hour after I woke up and taught me through the process step by step. She put the catheter in my arm and connected it to an IV bag. She asked me if I was ready, and I nodded, terrified about what was happening and horrified by my prognosis. She told me everything was going to be all right, and then hung the IV bag filled with saline, Ativan, and an anesthetic. My last coherent memory, before going under, was of my mother and her final moments. What happened next was the worst 5 hours of my life. I remember hearing music in my daze. At first, I thought the surgery was over until I heard the surgeon talking over the music, asking for a retractor to hold the surgical area open. I had 2 horrifying thoughts in that moment. The first being that Nicki Minaj's Anaconda was one of the most discomforting songs to hear playing in an operating room. The second was that I was going to be conscious for the entire surgery. They had taped my eyelids so I couldn't see anything, but I heard everything. As I laid there, unable to move during the gruff chorus of X Gonna Give It To Ya by DMX, the head surgeon asked if what he was seeing was really what made up the mass. I heard one of the assisting nurses gag as she excised the material into a pan. She excused herself, and someone joked that she wasn't good when situations got hairy. The people around him groaned at the pun that I wouldn't understand until they showed me what they had extracted. I was in surgery for 5 hours, conscious and paralyzed for the entire experience. Luckily, I felt nothing, but I heard every joke, jab, and bit of gossip. I heard the sizzle as the bovie, I looked it up later, cut and cauterized my wound at the same time. Those 300 minutes were the most excruciating moments of my life. It felt like I was on the table for an eternity, listening to music, puns, and the sound of my own operation. The worst part of it was the realization that I couldn't see what they were doing, and I had to imagine what was happening to me. My faculties returned a while after surgery. I didn't say anything to the attending nurse. I wanted to believe that what had happened hadn't actually occurred. The nurse was hesitant to show me what they removed, but I explained that I needed the closure. She told me the surgeon would show me when he gave me an update. I waited for 30 minutes, imagining the horror that they had removed from me before he arrived. He took me to a back room where he showed me the mass floating in formaldehyde. It was the size of a baseball and covered with hair, tiny teeth, and graying flesh. It looked like something pulled straight from John Carpenter's The Thing. He told me the surgery had been a success and they'd removed most of the growth. He reassured me when he noticed my concern by explaining that a small mass had fused to my spinal column in utero, and that it would be dangerous to attempt to remove it. He explained that my body had walled it off and encapsulated it, and there was no danger. To attempt to remove it could have left me paralyzed from the waist down. I thanked him and recuperated in the hospital for a few days, until I was able to go home. As soon as I got home, I looked into the mirror. There was a small line of stitches on my stomach, and a divot on my back where they'd removed my parasitic twin. I just wanted to put everything behind me and forget about what I had growing and rotting inside me. I wanted to forget about what I'd remembered from the surgery. I failed on both of those fronts. I spent the next month in a chemical daze. The doctors had prescribed me OxyContin for the pain. At first I was hesitant to take it, given my history, but the pain soon forced my hand. To be honest, it was pleasant. It felt like a ball of warmth at the center of my core that spread out throughout my body 30 minutes after I took a dose. Those 4 weeks drifted by as a fuzzy and warm memory, without anything interesting happening. It was so pleasant that I even pestered the doctor for another regimen of OxyContin under the pretense of pain. It was about 2 weeks after I finished the bottle that odd things began to happen. At first, I assumed my increased appetite was just me getting back to a normal diet after surgery and a month of opioids suppressing my hunger. However, I was eating more than usual. Usually I would cook myself something to eat and sit down with a book. As I got lost in the book, I would eat. Sometimes I would finish a couple of chapters before I realized I'd eaten multiple plates of food. I didn't think anything of it. I just assumed that the excised mass had cleared up some space in my stomach. The stomach pains were harder to explain away. I eventually broke down after the pain continued and went to see the doctor. He felt the area, and we talked for a while before he explained that it was likely a side effect of repeated opioid usage. He said it was common for prolonged usage to cause feelings of nausea, discomfort, and sometimes even anhedonia. He looked at me in a way that implied I was going to ask for another prescription. I wasn't, to be honest, but the implication was enough to keep me from pressing the issue. I agreed with his explanation and left without discussing my discomfort any further. The discomfort continued for a few weeks before the breaking point. I woke up in the middle of the night, screaming in agony. There was a sharp pain in my side, and in my confusion, I came to a sleep-addled conclusion. I had been stabbed. I looked frantically around my room for any sign of an intruder, but there was nothing. I made my way to the bathroom to look at the area. Oh, I wish that I had been stabbed. Instead, there was a quarter-sized chunk of skin missing from my back. I had been bitten. There was no mistaking the wound for anything else. I could see the area where teeth had scraped and cut into my skin, as if it had been pinched and torn into a ragged hole from the inside. I tried to block out the memory of what the mass that was removed from me looked like. It was that amalgamation of hair, greying flesh, and teeth. I won't lie. I had a complete mental breakdown when I connected all of the dots. I curled up in the fetal position and began to weep uncontrollably. It was too much. A recurring thought bounced around in my head like butterflies in the stomach. Why me? I started to have a panic attack on the cold tile of the floor. Why me? I began hyperventilating and couldn't catch my breath. Why me? I think I went crazy at that point, because the next thing I heard was, "It's okay. We're going to be okay." I looked around, half expecting someone to be in the bathroom with me, but no one was there. It wasn't until the voice repeated those words that I realized where it was coming from. it was coming from the hole in my back. Whatever was inside me was talking to me. I got up. I had to go to the hospital. I was having a psychotic episode and likely suffering from another mass. As I headed towards the door, it spoke again, its voice no louder than the wheezing of a respirator. "Don't go. They hurt me." I don't know why I responded. If I had to guess, I would blame it on the ridiculousness of the situation and my complete mental breakdown moments earlier. Something was growing inside me like a creature from Alien that could talk. I should have sprinted to the nearest hospital screaming, but instead, I spoke in a shaky, uncertain voice. "I have to. You're hurting me. If I don't, you might even kill me." What if I didn't? I can shift while I grow. I can make it so it doesn't hurt until I'm ready, and then we can work together to make it as painless as possible so we can both live. Ready for what? Until I'm strong enough to leave your body. Right now I'm not strong enough to survive outside of you. I just need you to sustain me for a few months. Please. They'll kill me at the hospital. Brother, I can be your friend. I want to be with you. I don't want you to be lonely. Please don't kill me. To be completely truthful, I don't know what made me agree. I can only try to explain my mindset at the time. I just had the worst experience of my life in a surgery room. If I had it my way, I would never return to a hospital ever again. I didn't want another repeat of what happened to me the first time occurring again. I also didn't want to relive the memories of my mother's glassy stare as I held her hand and waited for her to die. The thing growing inside me had promised it wouldn't hurt me. Oh, I don't know, but listening to that quiet tone was reassuring. It spoke in a way that reminded me of dogs whimpering and babies crying. The voice sounded weak and scared. I promised that I wouldn't go to the doctors. I think those were the reasons that made me agree to the stupidest decision I have ever made in my life. The first few days were the most awkward moments I have ever experienced in my life. Every now and then I would feel it shifting inside me and apologizing when it moved in a way that brought me discomfort. It explained that the surgery had only mangled it. It would need some time to heal and regrow, as it was still in the fetal stage and could produce fetal stem cells to regenerate. It held up its promise, and the pain I'd been experiencing for weeks went away. Now, a large part of me was still driven to go to the doctor and have my parasitic twin removed. I think the only thing preventing me from doing that was how frightened the voice sounded, and the realization that I would be murdering a living, breathing person. It wasn't until dinner one night that I felt any real sense of connection with it. I just sat down to have a cheap microwave dinner when the voice spoke. "What are you doing?" I was taken aback, as it had previously only spoken when it was apologizing for shifting. I responded that I was eating and reading a short story. We Can Remember It For You Wholesale, from an anthology. He asked me to read the story to him, and I did. I would read a paragraph to him in between each bite of food. When I finished both the meal and the story, he asked if I could read him another story. We spent the entire night reading and discussing various stories. As I enjoy multiple genres, I read a wide range of stories to the voice as it quietly listened. It wasn't until the sun crept in through the blinds that I realized how much time had passed. I had lost track of time while talking to my twin. We'd read dozens of short stories and spent hours talking about the ones we liked best. I went to bed after I promised my companion that we would continue this later. It became a daily fixture of our lives. Sometimes the voice would talk to me as I did chores or cooked a meal. I would always sit down for the meal with a book, and I would read it aloud while I ate. Sometimes I would have to stop and explain an event to them, but most times they just listened quietly and patiently. Afterwards, we would discuss our feelings on the book, or what we thought was going to happen. A sad part of me realized that this was the closest thing I had to a friend in almost a decade. I found myself looking forward to the discussions we would have after each meal. One night, a few weeks after their discovery, I heard the voice talking to me. I can only assume that it thought I was sleeping when it spoke those words. I had been asleep until I felt them shift inside me. What had once unnerved me now reminded me of a baby turning in their mother's womb. The voice twisted in my stomach and began talking. Soon I'll be with you. Soon I'll be able to touch you with my own hand. Soon you'll love me. I was so lonely all these years. No one to talk to. I experienced the world through you. Now I want to experience the world with you. I want to feel the sun on my skin and the wind in my hair. I want to be by your side. I kept those words to myself. A sad part of me realized that I now wanted the same thing. I wanted to be able to look at them while we talked. I wanted to take them outside and show them the world. I wanted a friend. Those words filled me with a warmth similar to OxyContin, and made me realize how lonely and depressed I had actually been up to that point. I had no one I could talk to, no one I could relate to. Now, I had a friend. Those words were lies. Subterfuge to convince me that it actually cared about me and make me suffer through the growing pains. The veneer of fraternity and friendship sloughed off to reveal the decay underneath. I woke up early one morning to find that the owner of the voice had gone still inside me. It was asleep. I quietly made my way into the bathroom to do my morning duties, when a macabre whim drove me to look at my back. The small hole in my back had almost quadrupled in size since it first spoke to me. I treated and disinfected the fistula in the hopes that I could slide them out of the canal when they were strong enough to survive outside me. Through the fistula, I caught my first glimpse of my twin as it slept inside me. It is not my twin. It's not even human. It has multiple eyes on its face that look more like a fly than a human. It is still in the process of development, and in the 30 or so holes that pocked its face, only a dozen were filled with actual eyes. Its skin is cracked, mottled and grey, like maggoty pork with tiny hair-like cilia breaking through its body. The thing's mouth looks like a lamprey eel, a concentric circle of needle-sharp teeth with a grotesque, sucking appendage in the center. I stared in horror for a few minutes before I realized that it was starting to stir. I moved away from the mirror and did my business before it could fully wake up. I left the bathroom knowing that this thing was not to be trusted. It had grown faster than any organism should. In a few weeks, it went from the size of a softball to the size of a watermelon. It has swollen like a cancer inside of me, and only now do I realize how thin I've actually become, due to it siphoning off my nutrients. I don't know where I contracted this thing, but it isn't an absorbed fetal twin. It is a parasitic entity growing within me, looking to be birthed into this world so it can infect others and perpetuate the cycle. It'll find the weak-willed, the weary, the wretched, and it will take advantage of them. It'll promise them false friendship and hollow hope as it incubates inside them. It is not human. It is a nightmare incarnate. How else could it regrow so quickly after being torn out of me by the doctors? The growth they removed was a bud, likely ejected to seed another part of my body. I can now feel dozens of other lumps on my arms, legs, and groin. Embryos in development. I am a hive. Now, its every movement sends waves of agony through me. It is strong enough to survive on its own, and it doesn't need its wretched host anymore. I try to hide the pain for fear that it'll realize how much of an advantage it actually has now. I know that the time of parturition is soon upon us, and there is only one choice left. It will likely kill me on its way out, to prevent me from trying to stop it. It is too late to go to the hospital. I am beyond help. The creature will realize what I am trying to do and stop me. It will either twist and constrict my spine, leaving me as a paralyzed nest for it, or simply debilitate me with pain until I can't move. Both are less than pleasant options. Even if I could make it to the hospital to remove them, was to stop the host from casting off more migrating buds to grow into those fiendish things. It wants out, and I can't allow that. I have my own option. The thing likely won't see it coming until it is too late. So, on to why I'm writing this. I always wanted to write. I spent so much of my life reading that it seemed like a logical progression. I don't know if it's irony, or if it's just the fumes from the gasoline I poured around the house that have now soaked into the rug, coated the walls, and furniture, and getting to me. But it seems comical when the only piece I write is basically my suicide note. I have to share this story before I strike the match. I can feel it stirring inside me as the fumes permeate the house, unaware of what I am planning. This thing. It breathes. It bleeds. It breeds. And soon, it'll burn. We'll burn. I know what will happen when the end comes, and it tries to break free and wriggle out of my shredded body. I'll hold it to me in my final moments. It will likely snap my spinal cord like a dead branch and paralyze me from the waist down. My legs won't matter though, as I have no intent on escaping. It'll scream, seethe, and shriek as the flames crackle and snarl around us. I will look into its horrifying visage, and I will smile. Even if its maliciousness made flesh, it is still my only friend left in this world. As the flames lap at us, I'll press it against me and whisper platitudes into its malformed ear. I'll tell it about how lonely I'd been since my mother died. I'll tell it how glad I was to finally have a true friend that understood me. As we burn together, I'll tell them how much I love them.
Now we round off proceedings for this evening with the gaze. Watching. I have something I must confess. I've been watching you. Yes, right this second. Unaware of my proximity, I've been watching you for the past several days. You have such a lovely home, full of space and dark corners. I like the dark. All that time, I've been in your home, just watching you. Well, not just watching, but we'll come to that later. I watch you perform your nightly routines before slipping into your bed under your warm blankets. I watch you until you fall asleep. I'm there to see you awaken in the morning to daybreak's new light. I am so still. My stare remains unbroken and undisturbed for hours and hours. You are so beautiful when you sleep. I wish you could see yourself as I see you. Your body is a sensual furnace of heat that radiates endless plumes of vibrant red, orange, and yellow flames as you slumber. I bask in your warmth and light. Your rhythmic rising and falling of your chest is the source of a breath that can ignite the very air around you, announcing to the universe that you are here and you are alive. The beauty of the spectacle can hold me in a trance the entire night, until the morning light forces me to retreat to my dark haven. Other nights, I come to you. You don't even feel my touch. Up and down your arms and thighs, I touch you with the utmost care. I would never want to disturb you while you sleep. Your skin is so soft and delicate, so unlike mine. Your body is a landscape of ecstasy, with a new wonder just waiting to be discovered and explored. Your aroma is intoxicating, and invokes an insatiable hunger that I surrender to and gorge upon. I then, quietly, make my way back to my hiding place. I am hidden well before the first rays of morning peek through the windows. I am so quiet. You never realize I was there. You awake and go about your life as you would any other day, while I sleep, content, but still filled with anticipation for what the following night will hold for us. I see that you have noticed the marks I left behind. Marks on your thighs and arms and throughout your body. I know they hurt, and I am truly sorry for that. But things like that are unavoidable when it comes to matters such as these. I am always so careful that my kisses are soft and delicate. I kiss your body ever so lightly and cautiously. I would not dare spill a single drop of your blood. It saddens me that soon I will have to share you with others. However, I know that you will be just as beautiful to them as you are to me. I know their touch will be equally as delicate as my touches have been. I know their kisses will show as much tenderness as mine have always had. My eggs will hatch any day now. The little ones will most likely hide within the mattress and frame of your bed, a trait for which we earned our namesake. I much prefer the nightstand next to your bed. The tiny crevice on its side allows me to look upon your face for as long as I desire. It is from here that I simply gaze and wait for our next encounter. Well, my sincerest thanks, as always, for taking the time to listen to tonight's podcast. If you like what you heard, then do me a little favour. Leave a 5-star review. Write a few nice words wherever you get your podcast from, because it really makes a huge difference to me if you do. Well, that's it for 1 week, but of course I'll be back again. Same time, same place, next week. So until then, very, very sweet dreams. Bye-bye.